Through engaging Peter McLaren's new book, Rage and Hope, which is a series of interviews with Peter McLaren on war, imperialism, and critical pedagogy, David Smith, a professor of education at the University of Alberta, takes us through a tour of the defining movements in the social sciences over the last 30 years. What makes David's work so fascinating and unique among scholars in education today is the breadth of his analysis, and in particular his roots in hermeneutics, where he traces the origins of ideas along with their basic assumptions that are often left unexamined in the present. Second, if we can still use the term fair-minded in the postmodern era, although he ultimately is critical of some of the major currents of thinking that is attempting to address our personal and collective pain and the ongoing injustices in the world, he gives these paradigms their due, rather than simply writing them off in the often reactionary and vitriolic way that is the hallmark of ideologically minded people. David begins the piece by noting that McLaren is a hero and may even be a prophet among us, whose championing of those 80% of the people struggling under the weight of the Euro-American tradition and its current manifestation of the world's first universal transcendental logic called the market, then you will find much to be in solidarity with Peter. Although Peter's work runs the gambit of the major currents of intellectual thought in the last 30 years, his most recent return to Marxism has left him highly critical of most mainstream critical theory, claiming that it fights capitalism's secondhand smoke without putting out the cigar. David then begins the piece by talking about how Peter, who has renounced his engagement with postmodernism, recounts basically the origins of this paradigm. I think this is an often misunderstood paradigm, and if we were to put it into some sort of organizing problem as a paradigm, we might suggest that basically postmodernism attempts to uncover the ways dominant groups have determined and are served by the cultural terms and narratives that shape social relations and cultural understandings. Thus, how our own sense-making does not belong to us alone and is actually highly politicized. A classroom organized around postmodernist thinking might learn to critically analyze and deconstruct knowledge and histories in terms of their central assumptions, who interests are served, how power is involved, and whose knowledge and perspectives are included and excluded. Postmodernism can be traced back to Friedrich Nietzsche, who was the first to really see the crisis of modernity due to the collapse of any values being secured through traditional means. And this is where David Smith is interesting, because he does not simply write off postmodernism theory, and actually later in the piece he argues that postmodernism then is best understood as being on the side of an open future which is pluralistic and free, and is primarily and implicitly political strategies that try to destabilize a univocal monocultural center. However, he does, along with McLaren, note that we need to do more than affirm our right to difference as a call for dignity and respect. He notes that pedagogically, because POMO can only celebrate difference rather than any unified foundational field of meaning, teaching loses all authority because there is nothing left to defend or to register any particular difference definitively against. And this is the fundamental shortcoming of the postmodern turn, in the sense that it is actually fearful of any sort of affirmative invention, because it seems to have this understanding that anytime you affirm something, it's somehow inherently totalitarian. From here, David examines the work of McLaren's New Marxism and basically argues that that class is the fundamental axis by which we need to understand all other injustices, including gender injustices. And moreover, conditions are such that reform is not enough. Only a complete revolution can heal the global human body. The demon here is capitalism and what is required to defeat the capitalists, but also the capital. If this talk seems a bit strange, perhaps it's worthy of noting the work of Fukuyama, who, after the fall of the Soviet Union, said that basically we've entered into the end of history, because their history until that point had been driven by a series of dialectics between capitalism and communism. But with the fall of communism, we now basically there was no other paradigm viably offering itself as an alternative to the current capitalist system. David notes Michael Boyd, who suggests that the world today suffers from acracy, that is, the inability of any government to control the logic of capital for the broader service of meeting real human need, not constructed need. And then David goes on to say that the dangers inherent in the current state of things, just as they are regrettable for signifying so completely a lack of imagination regarding how the human prospect might be conceived differently. After a long analysis on the nature of Marxism, he talks about how one of the worst parts of the current system that we have goes beyond simply the widening gap between the haves and have-nots, although noting that 3 richest people in the world have more money than the gross domestic product of 45 of the world's poorest countries, and 2025 richest people earn more than the total income of 47% of the total world population. Given this, his ultimate biggest critique of capitalism is that it's actually made human life superfluous. After a fairly complex analysis of Marxism, I think one of the things that popped up for me was on page 108, he said, "In education today, it is easy to see how such epistemology produces the cult of the expert, the person who knows about other people and places, but it has no awareness of the origin of his or her knowledge, nor any understanding of its connection to those people and places. So hence, education today suffers from historical amnesia." And then I think this is interesting. In the entire history of mass public education since the late 19th century, as far as I know, never once has there been a historical text available for students to help them understand the assumptions, aims, and intentions behind their 12 years of institutional compulsion. I think that the fact that that is actually quite normalized for us as teachers, I think is indicative of the current situation that we find ourselves in. Although David acknowledges that Peter is one of the most courageous critical theorists in the world today, who's not afraid of unmasking the hypocrisies that exist, he's actually ends up being quite critical of his approach. And I think one of the problems with Marxism, as David notes, although it may be good at uncovering injustices and horrendous gaps between rich and poor, it operates under the same set of epistemological and ontological understandings as the very things that it attacks. So in this sense, perhaps the only remaining Marxists living in the world today are the neoconservatives. Ultimately, David is quite critical of Peter McLaren's approach and asks, can in fact rage produce hope or just another more intensified tantrum? And he further states, actually I would suggest that neither rage nor hope are helpful tropes in the necessary struggle for global justice. Without going into a long explanation as to why he believes this, I think suffice to say that I think one of David's chief problems is the modernist baggage that Marxism carries with it, and that we need to have a reconnection of ontologically knowledge connecting with the human condition. Ultimately, David is critical of Marxism in terms of some of the underlying assumptions carried with it, and in particular the vision of human society it proposes. On one hand, Marxism historically has promised an end telos of utopia, which is inherently problematic because of the mechanistic inevitability that this will occur, and this is traditional Marxism, forestalls the necessity of human agency in the present. However, the new Marxists have although they have renounced this simplistic vision, they've replaced it with an endless becoming. And David is critical of the inability of this understanding to affirm what an ideal world would look like in the future. After this, he identifies 5 characteristics of a new historical moment we are within. The crisis in the West, the economic morass of many parts of Africa and South America, unprecedented growth in many parts of Asia, the emergence of new technologies, and globalization. He goes on to elaborate these, but the characteristics may be elaborated briefly by noting that the contemporary crisis in the West is indeed largely an economic reality, issuing primarily from the imperial venturing precipitated by the energy crisis, a situation masked by a war against Islam in the name of democracy and human. Perhaps the emergence of these 5 characteristics can offer an opening in the system whereby new possibilities can emerge. What makes David so interesting is that what he's offering is something beyond the postmodern turn, which is fearful of any affirmative invention, and he calls for both forms of resistance to the now almost universal enslavement within the labor-capital nexus, and this is where it becomes very important, but also new creative ways of imagining a better world, what Michael Peters has recently described as a new metaphysics of existence. As I can attest to in the classes I've taken with David, he has a 4-fold strategy whereby first embark with students on a radical mutual deconstruction of our own subjectivities that have formed under the current capitalist system. Second, undertaking a new discipline of mindfulness, which allow for these sort of consumer fantasies to fade away. And often in David's class, he'll have periods of meditation. And thirdly, challenging the market logic of capital as essentially irrational and that it cannot withstand any critical evaluation. We note again that the top 3 people in the world make more than 48 of the poorest countries in the world today. And then finally, I think with the ongoing economic crisis, to hold those schools of businesses and various commercial interests to account for the failure of market logic in the current meltdown of global financial markets, a meltdown precipitated precisely by the free market logic of neoliberalism of the last 20 years or so. In conclusion, I think David, as I will read his concluding paragraph, encourages everyone to read Peter McLaren, the New Marxist Humanists. As educators, we cannot understand the troubles of our students without understanding the deep political, economic groundwork that is underwriting their lives and our own as teachers. David provides somewhat of a meta-analysis that you will probably very rarely encounter in most critical pedagogy and certainly most mainstream educational thinking.